I'd like to start off by thinking about performance management. It's a word we use all the time. I use it all the time. We probably hear this word over 100 times if someone counted during today. But how often do we stop to think about what we actually mean by performance management? I like to think of performance management as not performance management, but really about performance improvement. And this is something that Johnny alluded to in his opening remarks. That this is really about how can we improve and develop employees on an ongoing basis. Hands up anyone who kind of agree with that we're all about performance improvement. Okay, glad, we're all on the same page. The rest of my presentation would be scuppered if you hadn't agreed with that. So if I'd asked you to sit down and think about how can we best improve the performance of our employees, come up with a tool that would do that, how many of you would end up coming up with this? Anyone, would they actually end up with that if that's what we set out to do? Nobody. Nobody's brave enough to put their hand up here. Yeah, so isn't it crazy that the majority of UK companies, according to the latest stats that I've seen, are still using this? They might call it something else, but they're still using this as the basis of their performance management. So I'd like to illustrate how crazy that feels to actually employees on the receiving end, and I'm going to give you a personal story. So I started my HR career in 1993. I did an HR degree and I graduated and I joined United Biscuits Hungry Graduate on their HR graduate program. I'd been used to getting feedback on a weekly basis. I had weekly tutorials. I was always told how I was doing. So imagine my surprise when I arrived at United Biscuits and I was told, well, you're going to find out how you're doing twice a year, once at an interim review and once at a year-end review. Oh, and on top of that, before you get that feedback, you'll have to fill out a 12-page competency framework questionnaire. Is that okay? Oh, and then on top of that, you're going to be labeled with a rating at the end. Oh, and by the way, the top rating, outstanding performance, or OP as it was called, is actually impossible to get, so don't get your hopes up for getting that. Is that sounding familiar to anybody in the room? Okay, crazy. Guess what I did? Well, I didn't last long. I stayed there for a couple of years. I got my training that they gave me. I got my CIPD qualification, and I left. Unfortunately, so did the majority of my graduate colleagues as well. And I think that says something about, I'm not saying it was all to do with performance management, but certainly from our experience, it's just not what we were expecting. So I joined Sony Music, very different company, and we didn't have appraisals there at all. So quite unusual, no appraisals, no formal performance management. But what we did have was a culture of what I would describe now as radical candor. So you got feedback all the time, good or bad, you were always getting people telling you what they thought of what you were doing. Now, I can't pretend that that feedback was always beautifully crafted and worded. Think the occasional four-letter feedback. But you always knew where you stood, and that was really great. So we maintained that culture, but I stayed there many years because I liked that culture. We built on that, and we did some great work in developing people. We did some great work about identifying future talent and developing those people through. And we did all of that without ever introducing an annual appraisal. Now, all good things come to an end. For me, it was a merger, demerger, followed by a new CFO who had the firm belief that employees were lucky to have a job, and there was no way he was going to give me any budget to develop anyone, so that was that. So I resigned, left there, and I decided to set up a performance and talent management consultancy to help organizations do performance and talent really, really well. So I was very excited. But can any of you guess what most of the engagements that we got in that consultancy were? Anyone want to have a stab? Can you design us an new annual appraisal form and a competency framework to go with it, please? Not really what I'd kind of set out to do, but we did it nonetheless. And I think we did it very successfully, and we ended up building our own performance management software because people said, this is great, you designed this new process, can you take it online? Yes, we did. And that software worked very well, it was well received, it streamlined what was a bureaucratic process, made it easier for people, it took away some of that admin pain. But did it actually improve anyone's performance? I don't think it did. And we had this nagging feeling that there was something missing in what we were doing. It wasn't the mission that we'd kind of set out to achieve. So in 2014, we sat down and we started with a completely blank piece of paper. That's my sad face from how I felt about that. We sat down with a completely blank piece of paper with one goal in mind. We said, let's forget everything we've ever done in terms of the tools and systems that we've done before and start from scratch and say, what are we going to do? What could we do that is purely about improving and developing people's performance on an ongoing basis? So we thought about all the things that we'd done over the last 10 years working with organizations, and we looked at all the latest research that was going on, and we came up with 5 principles, some of which aren't going to be very surprising because we're all talking about the same thing today. So that people should have near-term goals rather than annual goals. Because what happens with annual goals, you get to the end of the year and they're irrelevant. I think the IBM HR director said we have a ridiculous conversation at the end of the year about goals that are no longer, they're just no one's working on them anymore. Principle number 2 was that we should get feedback as soon as possible after an event occurs, not several weeks or even months later. Nothing more demotivating than being told months later you did something really well or even worse, something badly several months ago. Third principle, that we should be having regular future-focused conversations, not once or twice a year past-focus appraisals where we're trying to fit lots into one conversation. Now, I have a particular take on this because I think some organizations have adopted this, but they're still doing that annual, once or twice annual appraisal at the end of the year. Now, from the people that we've spoken to, that's a hard sell for managers. And I had an HR director say to me recently, and I think it was a great comment, that we've always said in HR there should be nothing that comes up at the annual appraisal that hasn't already been discussed. Anyone ever used those words? So what managers are now saying is like, so why do I need to discuss it again? What's the point? Can't we just have those great conversations? Why do we need to do this annual appraisal at the end of the year? And I guess this is the same point really. The fourth principle is that performance improvement comes from meaningful dialogue rather than form filling. So, can we take away or even minimize that form filling? And if we get all of this right, then managers should be better able to differentiate performance. So if we do need to do that administrative bit that Johnny referred to in his opening remarks, they're going to be more objective. They're going to be in a better place to do that because they've been doing these other 4 things. Now, we're pragmatists. We've worked with a lot of organizations. We've seen cynicism, and we know that in anything but the smallest of organizations, these kind of things are not going to work unless we answer some fundamental questions. And again, we came up with 5 questions that needed to be answered. Firstly, if we're working on these more agile near-term goals, how are we going to keep track of progress against them? A spreadsheet that we update and send back forward is not going to cut it. Secondly, how can we make sense and reflect back on feedback if it's being given in a very ad hoc way, sometimes verbally, sometimes in an email, sometimes an instant message? Thirdly, how will we get our managers to have regular performance management conversations? This is the question I probably get asked the most. If we're struggling to get them to do it once or twice a year, how are we going to get them to have more meaningful conversations and more regularly? And also, how will we know if they're actually doing it? So, the managers are telling us they're doing it. Are they? We don't know. And finally, how are we going to gather data about our high and poor performers? So, if we're having these conversations, great, but we still need to answer this question, how are we going to do that? So, we'd worked in software, and we realized that actually software could answer these questions really well. In fact, I think it's probably hard to answer all these questions without software. But we realized it couldn't just be any old software. So if we'd have taken the appraisal software that we designed before, did appraisals, competency measurement, all those kind of things, and we tried to get it to answer these questions, we knew it would fail. So rather than trying to take what we did before and trying to tailor it, which I know some technology has tried to do, we started again. So we thought about what technology could we build that would answer those questions that would all be about improving and developing employees on an ongoing basis. And that, obviously, is Clear Review. And this is just one screenshot of it here. And we launched it summer 2016. But what I would like to do in the last couple of minutes that I've got is talk about this word here, fear. And it's important for me because I have lots of conversations, as you can imagine in my job, with organizations all the time. And I don't want to preempt the debate about appraisals versus not appraisals, but pretty much everyone I speak to now is pretty clear that appraisals aren't working and that these more continuous conversations and feedback is a more effective approach. Yet they're incredibly scared of getting it wrong. And why? Because performance management affects everybody in the organization. So, it's a big risk to take. What happens if managers don't adopt it? What happens if people complain even more than they're doing currently? But what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that you can make continuous performance management work. How do I know? Well, here's some of the 50 organizations we've worked with in the UK just in the last 12 months that we've helped move away from appraisals to a more continuous performance management approach. And they come from a big range of sectors, so central government, public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, banking. We've even got, you can see a football club and a film studios up there. So a real range of sectors. So to address the question of what if managers don't like it, how are they going to feel about having to do this stuff? I'd just like to share a few comments that I just picked up from LinkedIn. Francis posted, after they went live, posted a comment on LinkedIn, and lots of employees added their own comments. And I was just touched by some of these amazing comments that we had. And this is what I get out of bed for in the morning. This is the mission that I was hoping to achieve. And also the question about adoption. Will people adopt it? Well, I've got some evidence on that. So Clydesdale only launched 10 weeks ago, and in that 10 weeks, on our system, we've had 50,000 goals captured, 17,000 bits of feedback, and 2,000 check-in meetings already, and that's just in the first few weeks. Now, I'm not saying it's really, really easy to get that. To get that, you have to be using a really simple process. The technology has to be the right technology, and which brings me on to my last point about simplicity. And we've heard it quite a few times already today. But it's easy to say the word, and it's very easy to forget about it and make things complicated without realizing. So I think it'd be useful to share a good benchmark about when you've got simplicity right. You've got simplicity right when you talk to people about something, maybe it's your managers, and they just get it. You don't have to spend ages explaining it. They just kind of understand it. Doesn't mean they always agree with it, but they get it if you've made it simple. And it's even more important when it comes to technology. I don't know if any of you ever use technology that feels clunky. I hear that word a lot of the time. That's normally just because it's not intuitive, it's not been designed the right way to do what it needs to do. But if you keep the technology really, really simple, then it doesn't become about the technology. And a good benchmark for that is if you don't need to train your people in how to use the technology, then that's okay. If you need to train people in it, then it's probably too complex. At Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank, they didn't train anyone specifically in the technology, which meant that they could spend time on the more important things about training managers to have great conversations. So on that final point of simplicity, I'll leave you with a great quote from Steve Jobs, who said, "Simple can be harder than complex," and it absolutely can, but it's worth it in the end because when you get there, you can move mountains.